Check it out, today I'm bringing you guys a review of the Montana Colors Street Ink. This stuff looks pretty killer, and seeing as I've got a full 1000 milliliter bottle on refill, and I'm definitely hoping that this ink is top of the line to get full use out of that whole bottle. I also got a couple mops and a couple markers here. You can see the mops come in two different sizes. We've got the 30 milliliter and the 90 milliliter volume, and the 30 milliliter has a 10 millimeter nib on top. The larger 90 milliliter bottle has a nib almost double the size of the small one. It comes in at 18 millimeters wide. And for the markers, there's just one option in two different colors. We've got the 15 millimeter chisel tip nib. This is going to be your run-of-the-mill 15 millimeter marker, a slight chamfer on the 15 millimeter edge, and then a straight edge on the 8. These markers are pump action, but I'm not sure we're going to get too many drips coming right from the marker, although these mops, I'm sure they'll have plenty to go around. If you want to check out any of the products I mentioned in this video, you can head over to sprayplanet.com. They sent over all this stuff, but as always, the review's totally about my performance and how this stuff worked out in the lab. So head over there if you're convinced this stuff performs well, and also save $5 off any order over $50 using the coupon code SPSIVE. That's SP for Spray Planet and SIVE for me. I'll also be filling up an 8mm round marker tip, so we'll see how they write on there. Those are some of my favorite ink markers to write with. Love the nib style on the rounded edge. Taking a closer look at the mops, the body is a little bit stiff, not too hard to squeeze. And as far as the nib goes, it's a regular soft nib. We'll see how it wears against some of the concrete surfaces. And then lastly, there is a regulator inside of there, so we can see how that restricts the flow and maybe pop it out if we need some more drips. First off, let's get that larger mop filled up, and maybe this extra little empty one as well. This is definitely the first time I've ever seen a refill bottle kind of in this paint can style. It's got a kind of funny hook on the top to hold it, I guess. And then we also got that screw top to close it off. It wasn't too hard to hold, and I'm glad they didn't go for just a 1000 milliliter round body. I could definitely see that being a little bit more troublesome to pour. The smaller spout on the refill bottle wasn't too hard to get into the funnel, and compared to some refills, I didn't even spill a drop, so good notes on this that it was pretty easy to pour and get into these markers. Before we get into the performance, I'd definitely like to say that these mops come in at a super affordable price. This refill bottle was $18.50, but they have smaller refill bottles that are just $8.50. And that'll refill over 6 of the smaller mops, so that stuff's gonna go pretty far. And comparatively, 200 milliliter bottles generally go for maybe the $10 or $12 price range. I'm definitely interested to see if the lower price point affects the performance much at all. The first test I want to do is just on a painted concrete wall. This will give us a really good example of how the markers kind of hold up when the surface is a little rough, but not so rough that it'll actually tear up the nibs. The markers don't have much of an issue on the smoother surface. You can see a teeny bit of streaking in some of the later tags. Much as you would expect, the marker isn't really able to get in some of the deeper grooves of the concrete. We've seen the same performance with tons of markers on this wall, but we should note that there's no dripping from these markers. It is also great to see that the opacity is the same throughout every line. Even on sections that we double up, we're not seeing any ink bleeding or ink cluttering because of the different pigments inside the markers. And that means for these markers that the nibs and valves are working together to totally spread out that pigment, not cluster anything up, and really give you a nice coat. Here on my last tag, I actually ran into a little bit of a wet section and had some paint come up onto my marker tip. The wet paint got in the way of the ink actually flowing out of the nib from there on out, so we got a little bit of streaking. I'll have to clean that section off before continuing with the red. A quick pause here though, you can already see that I've made some small impressions on the top of the nib. It's not totally square anymore, and what we're seeing here is that the nib might not totally be soft by any characteristic, but it is definitely impressionable. So if you are pressing it against the wall or you're grinding it down on something, these nibs will wear. So keep that in mind. I've never seen a 15mm marker nib get totally screwed up from just writing on general surfaces, but if you're writing on brick and hard concrete, I could imagine that this stuff will definitely wear down. And I will say that after working through this entire review and writing on a bunch of different surfaces, there was nothing super concerning about the marker nibs actually wearing down. I just thought this was a cool illustration if you plan to modify your nibs at all, or if you do like that kind of softer touch. A similar surface we're going to test this out on is a wood panel that's also been primed. As expected, we're going to get very similar performance. You can see that the deep ridges aren't catching the ink from the nib, but I also want to note that you can see the paint is having a little bit harder time actually flowing out of the marker now that we've got 6 or 7 tags in the works. But what I'll have to attest that to is the fact that, I'm writing on a vertical surface, so the marker's not having a ton of time to actually reflow and go up that nib. It's working against gravity. So here you might want to pump in between every, 5 or 6 tags just to make sure that you've got enough surface and enough paint behind you that you can go and finish that tag nice and clean. First up, we've got that 10mm black, and I'm going to hit it with some drips to start. Definitely some pretty consistent drips here. I didn't feel like I was stretching myself out to actually get the drips, nor did I feel like they were super uncontrolled. You can see we've got a little bit of a washout on my underline, but I can definitely say that that's where I was holding and squeezing hardest. Now let's hit a quick one and see if we can get it without any drips. So it's interesting to see the red now performing in a little bit higher volume setting. We're seeing a little bit more washed out drips. That means this body is a little bit thinner probably than the black, and for that reason they're kind of clustering down and kind of all coming down at the same rate. So now let's also see if we can get some without any drips from the red as well. It seems that since both these tags worked fine without any drips, still great coverage from the red, I just might need to work on my pressure to actually get this to work perfectly. Now checking out that larger 18mm, we're seeing the same performance with those big dips, maybe not hitting those ribs just as well. You're getting a little bit deeper contact with the nib, but we're also not seeing a ton of drips from this guy. It seems like we might need to take the regulator out on the larger guy. So if we take a look at the red mop tag, you can see some changes in opacity of the pigments within that red. This is pretty typical performance with any colored ink. The red pigments here are collecting together as the body of the paint is actually bringing them down the wall. So you might have some little bit darker sections at the bottom. This isn't totally the end of the world. I think the tag still looks fine. Just take that in mind. The red one does have, some translucency of the back white coming through it. So you're going to be able to see different values based on how much pigment's actually holding onto the wall. And you can also see if they were to dose this up with a ton of extra pigment, you'd then all have very, very deep dark red tags. Whereas here off the white surface, it almost looks nice that you're having a little bit of that white come through and brighten up the red itself. Now, I'm not a chemist here, but I'd assume that has something to do with how these red pigments are actually able to be held in something like an alcohol medium. Now, I'm not seeing the drips I like out of the larger mop. Let's take that regulator out and see how it works. So there's almost a world of difference in how many drips you're actually getting once you do remove that regulator. I now don't have to squeeze nearly as hard, and my drips are going to be super consistent. I'd say I definitely prefer this larger mop without the regulator. The drips seem really consistent, and not only do they flow a lot easier, I'm able to have a smoother tag because I'm not having to squeeze as hard. The reverse of this, it might be a little bit easier just to squeeze on that smaller body and actually get the drips with the regulator still in. And now, although that the larger body isn't huge in your hand, you definitely might not have the same grip unless you do kind of do the reverse grip and do it overhand. Needless to say, I'm definitely going to be sticking without a regulator in the big guy, and I'll leave it in for the small one. Now, taking some tags into a surface like paper where you're going to see it set in maybe a little, seems like the performance was pretty much on par with anything on the painted surface. The black covered nicely, super opaque, no issues there. Also dripped very well as soon as you added a little bit more pressure to that line. I definitely think for the price point, this stuff is working really, really well. As we saw with some of those larger drips in the red section, it does blow out a little bit easier. You might have to take a little bit more care to how much pressure you actually add, because here on the paper you can see it does kind of blow out and all bleed together when you do kind of just load it up. There's not as much surface for it to grab on with the paper, and it kind of just leaches out, leading to a pretty bold and unsightly line. I also like to see how the kind of translucent nature of the red holds up on something like aluminum. Writing on a metal surface is always going to work great for markers or mops. It's going to make these tags super smooth. And basically what I'm seeing here is that the red does have a little bit more translucency than it does with the white backdrop. You're not having as much opacity, but it seems to be holding up pretty well. There's even a slight opacity difference in the mop and marker. I'd say it's almost reversed between the red and the black. The red seems to get a little bit lighter as you're using the mop, and the black seems to get a little bit darker compared to the marker when you're using it in the mop. But altogether, that's super nitpicky. I'd say these tags, if they totally stood independent, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference, and they'd both look great. You're also going to be able to get some pretty sick drips on here. I took it easy as I wasn't trying to totally wash out everything below it. So for that being said, it shouldn't be too hard to actually control those drips and get something very deliberate. So already we've covered that these work great on a painted surface. They also work great on something smooth like aluminum. Now let's see how they actually stain when we try to cover them up with some paint. Ink markers are traditionally the thing you need to go to if you need staining or you need drip. At this point, there are plenty of paint-based things that can handle drips and look great even with a ton of opacity. So the staining properties are going to be the most defining characteristic of any ink. I'm going to use some general house paint here. We got a nice cream kind of off-white color. And we'll take little snapshots each time we do a coat and see what the bleed through looks like. After just one coat, you can see some bleed through from both markers already. Black's looking a little bit lighter than the red, but let's keep going. So after the second coat, I decided to do a time lapse to see actually the bleeding come back through the paint. And it's subtle, but I'll run it through a few times here with the red, and you can see that it actually does grow back out, but we've almost totally covered up the black at this point. So it's too bad that the black's only holding up over a couple coats. Let's hit this red with a bunch more and really kick it up. It really doesn't seem after letting these coats dry that there's much of a difference in this red. It's coming through slightly pinker and pinker each time, and after about 7 coats is when it really kind of kicked off that it was considering that I really wouldn't be, a fan of having the tag underline that. Now I can't say I have a grading outline to say how many coats of paint needs to be able to cover the ink before it gets an A+, but 7 coats is pretty hefty. Altogether, I'm a really big fan of this ink. So not to mention that this ink is some of the cheapest stuff on the market, I really don't have any complaints while using it. It only comes in that red and black color, so you are a little limited with that, but for the price point, getting this as a huge black refill is going to be some solid stuff to have in your back pocket. My only complaint here would be to see the black stain a little bit harder. You can always get a refill of both the red and black and throw a little bit of that red into the black and get some of those characteristics come through. I wasn't actually able to give that a try, but I've seen plenty of other inks that actually use some kind of more purple pigments, as those stain a little bit better within their blacks. And although it looks no different on the wall, after you start priming it, you're going to have those characteristics come up rather than just the black one. As far as the hardware goes, these are really typical mops and really typical markers. No complaints there. They work flawlessly, and even with taking out that regulator on the larger one, I was able to get some smoother tags and a little bit more consistent drips when I wanted them. Once again, if you'd like to pick up maybe this liter refill bottle or some of the mops and markers I featured here, head over to sprayplanet.com and check them out. I'll have links directly to everything I showed off here. Don't stop there, as they've got tons of spray paint and caps and everything else you need from MTN. And if you need even more of an incentive, you can save $5 on an order of $50 or more using the coupon code SPSIVE. That's SP for Spray Planet and SIVE for me. It's always great to hear from some of you guys that have used this stuff, giving your feedback on how it worked out in your applications. So don't hesitate with hitting that comment section with your feedback or just commentary about the video. If you enjoyed this review, feel free to spray that like button or consider joining the crew by subscribing so you don't miss any future uploads. I do weekly graffiti related videos, stuff like reviews or speed arts, so also feel free to check out some of that stuff on screen right now. Last week I showed off a huge custom print update where I printed actually these holographic vinyl stickers. Stuff came out super sick, so you want to check that out if you're interested in anything sticker related. I'll also have a random video linked on screen as well as in the description. Thanks again for checking out the video. That's going to do it for me. Peace.